It was pretty rough in the 90s, man, I gotta tell you.
Now you've of course rejoined the band with a fresh perspective, as you described. Is it also is it hard not to fall back in a certain role pattern that was built up over the years, or is that something that you can leave behind now?
It's an interesting with roles, because bands do have roles, you know, and members have roles, and it's interesting coming back into Megadeth now, because I think to some degree, you know, the Dave and David relationship is it's renewed and it's refined, quite honestly, much better, I think, than it ever was. And I think a big part of that too is having Sean Drover in the band. You know, Sean has been here now 6 years. Sean is a huge fan of Megadeth music, of metal music. He really got, like I always told him, I said, Sean, had you been in LA or New York or San Francisco back in 1982 or 83 when this was all starting,
yeah.
He would have been in one of these bands. He would have been in Exodus or Nuclear Assault or one of these bands, but he wasn't. He lived in Canada. So to some degree for him, he was able to, you know, have a family, raise his kids, and now that he's an empty nester, he gets to be in Megadeth and not have to, you know, he's kind of free to go now, you know, and he has been a real stability factor in Megadeth. And I think now with me coming back, Sean and I get along really good. Me, Sean, and Dave get along really good. And there's again, it's kind of like we're the two pontoons on either side of Dave. We're a left and a right, and it really stabilizes everything as it needs to be, because, you know, a band like Megadeth gets quite popular, and there's a lot of, you know, Dave's a rock and roller, man. You know, he shoots from the hip on a lot of stuff, and that's what we like about him. He's creative. He's a spark, you know, and I think it's nice that it isn't just me. And it probably is fun for Sean that it isn't just him anymore, that there's two of us that we really can, and the fact that we're the rhythm section, I think, is also a really cool dynamic.
Yeah, well, there's a big date maybe in the near future, the 22nd of June, I think. Yes, you play with the big... Do you see it as a miracle that all these bands from that era survived until now?
Yeah. In fact, it's...
Did you ever imagine that it would take place?
Well, you know, it's interesting. You know, we've all played together. We've just not all four played together on the same stage, you know. And I think the fact that we've all survived, number one, because we were pretty crazy back in the day, you know, especially a couple of us. But also the fact that our genre of music has survived, you know, which to me is a big testimony to the fans. You know, it just goes to, because they're the ones that kept it alive. I mean, a band can only be as popular as their fans make them.
Well, how do you think that the genre has aged over the years? Now it's almost, yeah.
You know, we went through a really weird transition in the 90s. I mean, boy, I remember when we took Korn out back in the Euthanasia tour, I think it was 1995, and boy, seeing Korn was a radical shift compared to what we were doing, and that, you know, to some degree, Clash of the Titans was the end of the thrash metal genre. And then those of us that, you know, us and Metallica and Anthrax had a little success with it, moving forward kind of with a new sound and developing. It was good, I think, but boy, you know, grunge music, new metal that came in. You know, we had a lot of these bands out, this Korn, Cold Chamber, a lot of these bands that were developing this whole, you know, modern sound. It was pretty rough in the 90s, man, I got to tell you. And thrash metal in and of itself kind of almost died, you know what I mean? And it had this rebirth here now in the last, say, 5 or 6 years. A lot of new bands, you know, especially Lamb of God, and, you know, a lot of these bands that have kind of revived that again. And it's cool because their influences were all Megadeth, Metallica, Slayer, Pantera, you know, Anthrax. And so for us to come together now and have our genre, and to some way maybe be bigger than it ever has been, is very, very cool.